to talk about Jesus did everything in his power to shame the leaders of the Jewish people. And as a consequence of that, they very much wanted to kill him. He knew that they were going to kill him. He knew that they and their fathers had been guilty of killing the prophets and men and women who were truly faithful to God for generations, for thousands of years. Different individuals had been claiming a degree of faithfulness, a degree of godliness, and then acting totally contrary. And Jerusalem in particular was a city guilty of this terrible sin of hypocrisy. It was the height of hypocrisy to claim to be godly and use that as an excuse for power, as an excuse to wrest people into your control, and then kill those who disagree. So Jesus pronounces judgment on Jerusalem, and his disciples are confused. He says that the temple is going to be destroyed, and they think, surely the temple being destroyed is the end of the world. Surely that signifies that God has brought creation as we know it to its completion. That there will be the end after that. And so, regardless, they ask him three questions. And they might have, in their minds, thought of it all as one great end-time event. But Jesus certainly answers it as separate events. They say, tell us, when will these things be? In context, these things is the destruction of the temple. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They really ask three questions here. Jesus answers in at least two parts. But the first question is the first thing he deals with. When will these things be? And so, in verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. The first thing he wants his disciples to know is that what he's about to tell them is going to be changed, wrested, confused by people. They're going to use it to manipulate and deceive. Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. You know, this is fascinating to me. The number one thing that happens these days when people hear of wars and pestilence and famine and earthquake and other signs mentioned in Matthew 24 is that they try and use those events to trouble others. They try and use those events to inspire in other people a fear of judgment and of the end. And I will say, people in the world ought to fear judgment. They ought to fear God bringing this creation to its closure, because God will come in judgment someday and we will see the end. But when they use this passage to teach that, and they use worldly events like wars and earthquake and famine and pestilence, they're wresting this scripture out of context, and they're doing the exact opposite of what Jesus says here. Jesus says, when wars and rumors of wars happen, see that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. He says these things are not the sign of what you just asked about, of the end. And we'll get into what the end is that he's talking about. He says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. When do false teachers have the best stranglehold around the naive and the ignorant? When the naive and the ignorant are in fear for their lives. When they think that surely the world is falling down around them. And we see, and Jesus even mentions later in the passage, that war and trouble in the land leads people to panic, and that leaves them susceptible to false Christs, they're false Christs, and false teachers. And so he tells his disciples, these things are not to be a sign to you that the end is here. That's the beginning of the end. That's nothing of consequence in the grand scheme of things. He says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Now we're getting into a sign that's a pretty good sign. I'll tell you, earthquakes and famine and pestilence and wars, that's not a very good sign that an event is about to occur, because those things have been happening since the beginning up till now. And so if somebody gave those things as the sole sign of some prophecy that they said would come to pass, and they say, you'll know this is about to happen because there's going to be wars and famine and pestilence, you say, well, that could happen any old day now then. For all of human history, just about. Unless we're talking about a local region and a specific group of people. And I believe in the context here, we're talking about a local region and a specific group of people because Jesus tells his disciples here that had come to him and asked. He doesn't tell all Christians for all time. He tells Peter, James, John, and the others, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. We see that take place in the first century, beginning with the Jews who first killed Christians, Stephen, of course, James the Apostle, and eventually leading up to persecution under Emperor Nero just before AD 70. Christians were hated by everybody in the Roman Empire within the first century. They were viewed as the scapegoat, the fall guy for every disaster that came down the pipe. And so they were being killed. They were hated because of their faith in Jesus. And he tells them, he tells the apostles here, this is going to happen to you. He says, then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. You know, we see this happen within the first century as well. The Hebrews letter, if you look into the context of it and why it was being written, it's because Christians were being persecuted. They were being put to a public shame and mockery, and they were having their goods stolen from them. And the Hebrews writer says, you're about to suffer unto bloodshed because of their faith in Jesus. And many of these Jewish Christians were going back to the law of Moses because their families were persecuting them for their faith in Jesus. Their local governments were persecuting them for their faith in Jesus. And it was about to get to the point to where their federal government, the Romans, would persecute them even to bloodshed. And the Hebrews writer is telling these Christians, do not draw back to perdition. It's about to get worse. You need to hold the course. Well, Jesus told us this would happen. He says that there would be these false prophets. We see false prophets in the first century. There were people that taught there was no resurrection. There were people that taught that Jesus didn't come in the flesh. We had the Gnostics. We had the Judaizing teachers who taught circumcision. And they all perverted the gospel. And so people were finding all sorts of different compromises to kind of back away from the very controversial Christian faith that the apostles taught and avoid some of this hardship and persecution. He says, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Certainly there was a great falling away. Certainly many left the faith because of them being tempted away from Christ and into sin by persecution, by difficulty with their families. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom we preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then the end will come. Now that statement there, we read that and we say, well, that's the end. Surely. Surely that's the end. Not you, Shirley. I'm sorry. But we say, surely that's the end. Because the gospel's not gone out into all the world. Right. Well, in a sense, it did in the first century. And we'll look into that right here. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus told the apostles, specifically the apostles, the ones that received the baptism of the Holy Spirit, you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses of me in Jerusalem, and in Judea, and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. Those men who received the Holy Spirit, he said, you're going to bear witness of me to the ends of the earth. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8, Paul tells the brethren in Thessalonica, from you the word of the Lord has sounded forth, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Paul's experience when he went around the Roman Empire preaching the gospel was that everybody had heard something about this Jesus guy. That they all knew somebody who was a Christian. Or they knew somebody who knew somebody. And it seemed like a lot of those connections led back to Thessalonica. And he praises the Thessalonian brethren and says, from you the word of God has sounded forth. When I go and preach somewhere, they already know what I'm going to say. Now, how do we explain the fact that the Roman Empire isn't the whole planet? Because surely the gospel went out into all that great empire and the far reaches of their influence. Well, the word for world that means planet is cosmos. You have to remember, the ancients didn't have an idea of a little blue dot floating in space called the planet Earth. They just saw the material world as they knew it. And when they referred to all of created everything, they used the word cosmos. Today we use cosmos to talk about the universe, the far-flung expanse of space. But to them, when they wanted to refer to the whole creation, they used the word cosmos. And when they wanted to refer to the inhabited land, to the known world where humanity dwelt, they used the word oikumene. And that's the word that Jesus uses when he says, this gospel of the kingdom we preached in all the world. He says it will be preached in all the inhabited land. And surely it was. Maybe the far-flung tribes of the earth out in desolate regions didn't hear the gospel of Jesus in that first century, but I'll tell you, the inhabited earth did. And so he tells them that they'd be persecuted, the gospel of the kingdom we preached in all the world, and then the end would come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, Jesus says. Matthew says. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What is this abomination of desolation? He's using some very cryptic language. The Jews probably would have been familiar with this language, but it would have taken some digging for them to really understand it. The prophet Daniel mentions in 3 different chapters, Daniel 10, 11, and 12, of a cataclysmic event of great judgment befalling Jerusalem and the people of the city. And he calls it the abomination of desolation. And people argue about whether Daniel was referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in Jesus' time, or whether he was referring to the time when Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek general, caused pigs to be sacrificed on the altar. But regardless, Jesus says the abomination of desolation is making an appearance. When you see that thing spoken of by the prophet Daniel, then you need to run. Luke interprets this for us. He's writing to a Gentile audience that didn't have the benefit of the Old Testament scriptures. And he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, apparently the abomination of desolation, to put it simply, is foreign invaders surrounding the city. And so Jesus says, when you see this, flee to the mountains. That would be pretty counterintuitive if you lived in the first century. We live in a society where we've watched Red Dawn growing up, and we think when the Chinese paratroopers come in that we all need to go and hide out in a holler somewhere in a creek bottom or hole up in a cave and wait things out. That's the way that we typically think. We don't live in a society of walled cities and of armed garrisons of those cities. But in that day and time, when an army came to town, you went in where there was a wall. And you hid behind that wall and behind those defenders. And Jesus tells them to do the very opposite. He says, when armies come up and surround Jerusalem, if you're in Jerusalem or the surrounding area of Judea, don't hide in the city. Run. Flee for your lives. Let him who's on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. You know, when you live in a stone or a mud brick building, you live in a hot, dry place, the heat radiates out of those stones long after the sun has dropped low in the sky. And the day will have cooled off in the evening, but your house is still radiating heat like an oven that still hasn't cooled down all the way after you're done cooking. And so they would go and sit on top of their houses in the evening time and catch the breeze that was blowing through and enjoy the cool evening when the house was too hot to hardly stand it. And they would have a stairway, not inside their house with a hole in the roof, because that's silly. That's how you let all the rain in. They'd have a stairway on the side of their house, outside. And if you were coming down the stairway, he says, don't turn and go back into your house and grab your things. You just run. You just leave immediately. He says, let him who's in the field not go back to get his clothes. If you're all day working in the field, whether you're scattering seed or you're pulling up whatever you planted or taking the scythe to the wheat, whatever you're doing, and it's hot and you're working hard, and you leave your coat at the edge of the field where you started, he says, don't go back to where you started and grab your coat. Just run. Just head for the hills. But woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. If they had to flee Jerusalem and Judea in the winter, it would be a pretty hard time. You know, deserts are hot during the day, but cold at night, especially in the winter. And you don't want to have a fire to keep you warm when a hostile army is in the land. They'd see the smoke, they'd smell it, they'd come for you. And so he says, pray that this won't happen in the winter. Pray that you don't have young ones that you have to force into hard travel, or pregnant wives or mothers. And he says, pray that it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. Now, Christians wouldn't need to worry about traveling on the Sabbath day. That was lawful for people living under Christ to do. Colossians chapter 2 teaches that the Sabbath and the handwriting of requirements were nailed to the cross when Jesus was crucified. They were done away with. But if you lived in a Jewish city that had a wall, it was their custom since the days of Ezra and Nehemiah to close the gates on the Sabbath day so that foreign merchants wouldn't come into the city and buy and sell and entice you to break the Sabbath by buying and selling with them. And so they would close the gates to discourage this behavior and to discourage travel and trade on the Sabbath day. And if you were in a city that had Jewish guards, they were not going to open the gate for you while an army was at the door so that you could run out. They would, number one, be breaking the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath, opening the gate for you. And number two, everybody else is trying to get in. Even the people in the countryside that are wanting to get into the city for protection. Why would they open the door, especially for you, and let you out? So he says, pray that this doesn't happen on the Sabbath. That's, again, what Luke said. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And we need to ask ourselves, who are the elect here? In the context of Matthew 24, who are the elect or chosen of God? He says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Jesus seems to indicate that the elect here ought to know better. They're the people that ought to have an understanding of His Word and of right and wrong, and that would obviously be God's real people. Not just the ethnic nation of the Jews, but the faithful in Israel. Judea and Israel, Jerusalem, they were all full of ethnic Jews, and then Jews who came to the Messiah. The Jews who came to the Messiah, the Christians, they're the elect in this context. And they are meant to escape the destruction coming to the rest of the Jews. But Jesus says these false Christs are going to show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And I want to suggest to you some of those signs and wonders, probably all of them, were not miraculous signs and wonders, but it's the same type of false prophesying that people always do. Let me clarify. When Jeremiah predicted the first destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, he was one prophet crying out to the people there in Jerusalem that the end was coming. Meanwhile, there were hundreds of prophets saying peace and tranquility. There were hundreds of prophets saying, we're the people of God, He won't forsake us, the city will stand forever, the temple will never be destroyed. And Jeremiah was going up against a flood of falsehood. The Jews in Jesus' day and the apostles' day likewise thought themselves to be invincible. They thought that they were the chosen people of God whom He would never forsake, and that they would be given victory over all their enemies. And they had been on a winning streak for a little while, and so they were getting kind of cocky. And so, in AD 66, a guy named Gallus, you might say Gaius too, I don't know. His first name was Gaius, and his last name is spelled this way. I don't know if you say it Gaius or Gallus, but it'd be a shame if he was Gaius, poor guy. He came up against Jerusalem in AD 66. And he surrounded the city and for several days besieged it. And I imagine that when he surrounded the city, all the Christians said, this is the sign that Jesus told us to wait for. And so they head for the hills. They leave with everything they have. They leave behind everything they have and hide out until Gallus inexplicably leaves. And historians still argue about why he left, but he surrounded the city, and then he leaves, and all the Jews say, God is with us! The temple will never fall! The city will never fall! And they think that they're invincible, and that God has brought them a great turn of events. And so, eventually, Gallus even gets ambushed by some Jewish forces, and much of his army is decimated as he is heading back to Rome. And so just the next year, this guy named Vespasian besieges the city for 2 whole years. He besieges the city. He takes the lower city even. And as he's about to break into the walls of the main part of the city, suddenly he turns around and leaves. And none of them knew why at the time. And they all, again, roar and rave and strut around like little baby roosters and go, God is with us! The city will never fall. The temple will never be destroyed. And can't you imagine all the Christians left when he came up against the city as well, if any of them came back from the hill country. And all the Jews are starting to get to them. Because all these false prophets who say that God will never forsake the Jewish people and that Jesus was a false prophet, twice now, the Christians have expected the city to fall, and twice, almost without explanation, these Roman generals who have the might of the greatest empire the world has ever seen behind them, they come up against the city and leave before they have victory. Now, the actual reason Vespasian left is because poor old Nero back in Rome killed himself. And there was a vacancy for the throne of emperor of the Roman Empire. And so he and 3 other generals from the far-flung parts of the world all rushed back to Rome and fought it out. Wouldn't you know it, Vespasian comes out on top. He's the new Roman emperor. And he sends his son, Titus, to finish the job that he started. And so the next year, AD 70, Titus comes up against Jerusalem. And it's the 3rd time that a Roman army has surrounded the city within 4 or 5 years. If you're a Christian, and twice now, you've taken your family and left everything behind and fled for the hill country, and then came back into the city after the army leaves and the city's still there. And all the Jews of the city mock you and persecute you because you thought that the city would fall, and they say, "Uh-uh, God is with us. God will never let this city fall." And this 3rd guy comes up against the city. What are you going to do? Do you say, well, twice now I've been proven wrong. The city's still here. I guess I'm going to stick it out in the city instead of suffering in the wilderness. And we'll see if there's something to what Jesus said or not. Or are you going to have faith in what Jesus said and you're going to leave the city again? If possible, Jesus said, these false prophets would deceive even the elect with their great signs and wonders, with their false prophesying. And so I'm sure some Christians probably left the Christian faith and went back to Judaism as a result of these 2 invasions that fell short. But in AD 70, Titus comes up against the city and he destroys it. And nobody in the city is spared. Some people managed to get away just barely if they left before the actual city walls fell. But, I mean, it was a minuscule portion of the city. Everybody that was there was slaughtered or slaved or crucified. They did all sorts of terrible, terrible things we don't need to speak of, especially publicly from the pulpit. But it was a bad time. It was a calamity like the world had never seen. So Jesus says, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. There would be prophets around that time when all these wars and persecutions and calamities are taking place that would take advantage. They would take advantage of the mass panic and the hysteria. And they would say, I'm the Christ. I'm here to deliver the Jewish people. I'm here to fight off the Romans. And it really was a heyday for the zealots and the people that wanted to fight Rome. And Jesus says, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. All these false Christs who say that God is going to deliver the Jewish people, all these zealots, all these people stirring you up against Rome, and they build up some following in the desert, or they call some convocation in the temple, don't believe it. Because when I come back, nobody's going to have to summon you into my presence. Nobody's going to have to send for you and wait for you to arrive, because it's going to be instant. It's going to be like lightning. It begins in the east and flashes to the west. This is the one verse in this section here that is about the final end. Jesus says, when I finally do come back in final judgment, there's going to be no slow gathering of the people. It will be immediate. He says, so also the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. The carcass here is Jerusalem. The birds of prey, the vultures, the eagles, are feeding on this rotting, festering corpse. They're taking advantage of the calamity that is befalling the Jewish people during these years of war. In verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. That means when the tribulation takes place, when the city actually falls, he says, immediately the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And a lot of people say, look, that's the end. That's the end. That's the end of the world. The stars falling from the sky? Not quite. First of all, if that's the case, then Jesus is a liar. Because he said, immediately upon the completion of these things that would happen in that generation, the destruction of the temple, immediately after, then the moon would not give its light. The stars would fall from heaven. And last time I checked, the stars are still up there and the moon still gives its light. So did Jesus lie? Or is this not talking about the literal sun, moon, and stars? It's not talking about the literal sun, moon, and stars. And so we're going to look into what are the powers of the heavens and what does it mean to be shaken. Powers of the heavens, we can see, well, I actually better turn over there. Think first. When Joseph had his vision, his dream, that his parents were the sun and moon, his siblings were the stars. Remember, Isaac and Jacob, had his children, and Joseph being the one favorite of them, they all hated him. And he dreamed that his parents, the sun and moon, and his siblings, the stars, bowed down before him. That was a dream predicting what would happen when he delivered them from the famine in the days when only Egypt had grain. But again and again in the Bible, the sun, the moon, the stars are used to depict people, not the actual heavenly bodies. And one of the places we can go to establish this is in Isaiah, the 14th chapter. In Isaiah 14, God tells Isaiah that the people need to take up a proverb against the king of Babylon. And so they have not yet gone into captivity. And he tells them, when you have rest from this captivity, in verse 3, it shall come to pass in the day the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and from the hard bondage in which you were made to serve. You'll take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor is ceased, how the golden city ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked. This is all about this man who would be ruler over them. In verse 12, still talking about this man, it says, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you were cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. Now people read that and they go, oh, that's the devil. He was cast down from heaven. No. In the context, Isaiah is talking about this man who in his heart exalted himself to the heavens. He thought that he was a god. Well, the kings of Babylon did think they were gods. Nebuchadnezzar built that golden image. Darius commanded that nobody would pray to anybody other than him for 30 days. They believed that they were gods in the flesh, and that was true of great leaders of the world going back to the Egyptians. They believed that they were gods in the flesh. And here, God is comforting his people, saying, when you come back from captivity, that man who thought he was a god, who ruled over the earth, you'll be all right, and he'll be long gone. You will be rebuilding, and he will be in hell. Literally, talks about him being brought down to the depths of the pit. It says in verse 16, those who see you will gaze at you, still speaking to this man, the king of Babylon, and consider you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms? But he was called Lucifer. Lucifer is only used this one time in the Bible. That is a name, is a proper name like that. Really what it means is morning star. This man, king of Babylon, is called the morning star. And I'll ask you, what's the brightest star in the sky? It's not the North Star. That might be our first instinct. It's the morning star. Because even after the sun has come up and all the other stars are too dim to be seen, you can still see the morning star. It's the only one bright enough. And so here, this man is called the brightest star in the sky. He was the most powerful ruler of the earth. And by the time that the Jews had rest from captivity, the king of Babylon was no more. Babylon had fallen to the Persians. We see, though, God uses heavenly bodies to represent earthly people. It is the language that we oftentimes call apocalyptic. In apocalyptic literature, not everything is literal. It's symbols, it's signs, it's figures. In apocalyptic, when we use that word, we see part of that is apocalypse, or similar to that. We're familiar with the zombie apocalypse, the COVID apocalypse, and any number of different ways the world is supposed to end, the apocalypse. But really that word just means the unveiling or the revealing. It's an old Greek theater term that referred to the curtain call when you saw all the cast basically come out and reveal that they weren't actually whoever they were playing. They revealed who they actually were. Everybody would give them praise and accolades and laurels for their good job up on the stage. But that word is used of revelation oftentimes because that is the curtain call. God revealing what would happen. In many places it says soon after those things that John was seeing. Here in Matthew 24, when Jesus uses apocalyptic literature, he's revealing or unveiling what's going to take place. The great, haughty, powerful, important people of the Jews, who were they? The chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the high priest. They were cast down. They lost their place of prominence. They viewed themselves as the pinnacle of creation, as the holiest of holy among God's holy nation. And they were humbled when the city fell. He says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. When I read this in the New King James Version, I think of the bat symbol. It says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. I think of some big glowing symbol in the sky. I'll tell you, the New King James translation is probably not the best translation. You'll see I have written here the LGT. That's the Luke Goad translation. It's not published yet. But you read up on the Greek in this passage, and I think this is the best way to render this sentence. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven shall appear. Not the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. Twice in this context, Jesus quotes from Daniel chapter 7. The next thing he says is, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That's also from Daniel chapter 7. It should be in quotation marks. He's saying that after the calamity of the destruction of Jerusalem, after that tribulation, people would see in their mind's eye the fulfillment of what Daniel prophesied. What did Daniel prophesy? I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Daniel was having a vision or a dream. He calls it the night vision. It's a dream. He was asleep. And he beheld one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds. Or actually, it would be coming with the clouds. It wouldn't be him seeing Jesus come down on the clouds. He was watching Jesus come up on the clouds. Because in this vision, Daniel was not on earth, he was in heaven. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, that his dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom the one which will not be destroyed. And so what does this mean? The sign of the Son of Man in heaven will appear. Rather, the sign of the Son of Man in heaven shall appear. It means the sign which Jesus, the Son of Man who had at that time ascended into heaven, the sign he gave would come to pass. The sign which verified he truly was the Son of God, that his word was prophetic and true, that he was reigning at the right hand of the glory on high. What was his word? What was the sign he gave? The destruction of Jerusalem. That not one stone be left upon another. You know, it's said that the gold inlaying and the gilding on all the different vessels of the temple and on all the pillars and walls and things, when they set that temple complex ablaze, the gold melted. They say that it ran between all the cracks in the mortar and bricks. And that the Romans sat there and pried up even the bricks of the foundation to get the gold out from between the cracks. Literally, not one brick was left in place upon another. That's what ancient historians have offered up. When Jesus' word came true, the people of the earth who had heard of these Christians, who had heard of this Messiah, I think the honest ones mourned. They realized that he was the Son of God. They realized that his word was true. And they saw in their mind's eye Daniel's vision. They realized that Jesus had ascended on the cloud before the Ancient of Days, and that he was reigning over his kingdom, namely the Jews. They were scattered to all the tribes of the earth. The synagogues were all over the place. They saw in their mind's eye that they had missed the Messiah. That they were awaiting a Messiah when the Messiah had already come, and that he had already ascended up to God and received the kingdom. Matthew 24:31. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. You say, Luke, this has got to be about the end. The end. The final gathering in of God's people. I'll tell you, it can't be. And we'll get to that in a moment. But let's first consider Matthew again, or rather Jesus, is using Old Testament prophecy. He's done this already with the Daniel 7 passage. Here he's using largely Isaiah 27. God had promised that he would gather together his people, the Jews, that he would gather them together back to Mount Zion, following the great destruction under the Assyrians, following Babylonian captivity. And you know what? Up until Jesus' day, it had never happened. Some of the captives came back. A lot of them remained scattered to the four winds. That's why there were synagogues all over the world. That's why Paul was able to go throughout all of the Mediterranean preaching the gospel to Jewish synagogues. That's why we read about Apollos being from Alexandria in Egypt, where he had learned about the Jewish faith, because there were Jews in Egypt and all over northern Africa. And Isaiah wrote about when God would gather together the Jews. It shall be in that day the great trumpet will be blown, and they will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria, and they who are outcast in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. You know what? Up until Jesus' day, that had never happened. There was no sounding of a trumpet. There was no gathering in of the Jewish people. Jesus, though, says, following the destruction of the temple, when the tribes of the earth mourn, when they see the Son of Man ascending up to the Father on the clouds, when they realize Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah and that he reigns from heaven, that's the trumpet sound. That is the call to the Jewish people to gather together and worship at Mount Zion, at Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem's just been destroyed. So what Jerusalem are we talking about? Well, I guess I need to go over Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, we learn what Jerusalem is after Jerusalem is gone. Beginning in verse 18, Paul, Hebrew writer, almost said Paul. For you have not come to the mountain that may be touched, that burn with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, and those who have heard it beg that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. He's talking about Sinai. The Hebrews writer says, you Christians, you've not come back to Moses and Sinai and the old law. He says, but you have come, verse 22, to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect. And so what's all this about? Well, Jesus said He's going to send His angels, and they're going to gather together the elect. The sound of a trumpet, same thing comes up in Isaiah. And they're going to come to Jerusalem. The Jews were scattered across the world, losing their identity, becoming more worldly, becoming more Greekified. And the gospel sounded forth. If you remember in 1 Thessalonians 1:8, we already read that passage. Paul says, from you the word of the Lord has sounded forth. The gospel is the trumpet here. It gathers in the Jews who were awaiting the Messiah, not to earthly Jerusalem, to heavenly Jerusalem, to the church, to worshiping Jesus. So what's this about angels? Since when did angels preach the gospel? Well, that's the word for angel, angelos. You want to know the Greek word for preacher? Angelos. Angelos, angel, it just means messenger. It's transliterated into English instead of translated into English. It just means messenger. Jesus says that He's going to send out His messengers with the great sound of a trumpet, and they'll gather together His elect, the Jews who are awaiting the Messiah. And they'll come from one end of heaven to the other and gather together to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the church. An evangelist is a messenger. A messenger of good. It literally means a good newser. Greek is funny like that. You want to know the word for gospel? This part's also kind of cool. Evangelion. Gospel. You have the word angel right there. Right in the middle of the word. It's the good news, or the message of good is probably the easier way to put it. And so Jesus said that this destruction of Jerusalem would be basically the final sounding forth, the final evidence, the final sign of His to the Jewish people that they needed to gather together to the new kingdom, to the true kingdom, to the heavenly Jerusalem, not to some earthly bastion of the law of Moses, but to the new covenant in Christ Jesus. And that's exactly what takes place. And so He tells them, learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. I know that when the Bradford pears start blooming, I don't like Bradford pears, but they're great for this one thing, crappie fishing time. The spawn is upon us. Now, I know that Tyler and Steve can catch crappie any time of the year. They don't need to wait for the Bradford pears. But spawn happens when the Bradford pears start to bloom out. Jesus uses a similar analogy. He says, all these signs are like the first buds of spring. When you see all these things taking place, you know that my word is about to come to its fulfillment. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. You might have said earlier, Luke, you're crazy. This is talking about the final judgment. This is talking about the end of time, not about the destruction of Jerusalem. I hope I'm not wrong, because that would mean Jesus is a liar. That would mean that Jesus said all these things would take place in the first generation, and the final judgment still hasn't happened 2,000 years later. But I'll tell you what, from AD 30, when Jesus said these words, to AD 70, when the temple was destroyed, 40 years. How long is a generation in the Bible? How long did it take that generation in the wilderness to die out? 40 years. 40 years, and God eliminated the wilderness generation and brought about a totally new generation to come into the land of promise. Before that even, Stephen says that another 40 years had passed when Moses was in hiding in the land of Midian, because even a generation of Egypt had rejected Moses, and God waited for all them to die out before Moses came back and led the next generation in the wilderness. And it was 40 years for them to all die out before God led the third generation into the promised land. But biblically, 40 years is a generation. The temple was destroyed during Passover week of AD 70. When did Jesus say these words? Passover week of AD 30. It was 40 years down to the week. It was a real buzzer beater of prophecy. I guess if it had been 41 years, then you might say that some of those people would still be living. But I really think it's significant. Exactly 40 years passed. That generation passed away with the temple. All those things took place within that generation. Now, I know we've gone for a while. I'm wrapping up quick. The true end. Jesus switches gears, and he begins to compare this new destruction of the world, this new final judgment, with the judgment that took place under Noah. Not the judgment of some little local geographical region, but a worldwide judgment. He says of that day and hour, the final day and hour, no one knows. Earlier he said there's all sorts of signs and ways for you to know that the end of Jerusalem and the temple is coming, but of that final day and hour, no one knows. Remember, he's answering multiple questions from them. They said, when will these things be, the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of my coming, the end of the age? He says, no one will know. Not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were before the flood, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. Sudden calamity. They didn't expect it. Noah warned them. We warn the people of the world about judgment, but they still go on living in sin, futility of the captivity of the devil. He says, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. There's not going to be some heavenly bat symbol to let us know to hurry up and get ready. There's not going to be some sounding of a gong to tell you you've got 5 minutes before the doors close. You have to be ready. And in fact, that's exactly what Jesus says. He says there'll be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Pop quiz. Which one do you want to be? Do you want to be the one that's taken, or do you want to be the one that's left? In our culture that talks about the rapture, we assume that the way to be is to be taken, to be caught up in the air. The Thessalonian letters haven't been written yet. Nowhere in the Scriptures, when Jesus said this, was there any indication that the final judgment would involve being caught up in the air. And rather, in the immediate context, Jesus just said that the people who perished in Noah's flood, the flood came and took them all away. The flood took them away. They were taken. This is the language of calamity. Jesus isn't explaining the methodology of the final judgment. He's explaining the suddenness of the final judgment. And he says these people were taken unexpectedly. And so here he says there are going to be people all over the world going about life as normal. And calamity will take some of them. And some of them will be left in peace. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. I'm convinced this and other statements from Jesus like this are why Peter begins to refer to the Lord as coming like a thief in the night. He's referring back to this parable. That if somebody knew when their house was going to be broken into, they would prepare the day of. Jesus says, you don't know when your day of calamity is coming. You don't know when disaster is going to strike. And so therefore you also be ready. He doesn't say get ready. He says be ready. This is ultimately the problem of teaching Matthew 24, is all being about the signs leading up to the day of judgment. It's a scare tactic. And people do that to convince the gullible and the ignorant and the frightened to join their denomination. The world's about to end, and so you better get right, and we're the ones that know about it, and so you better come and join us. That's what people do. I'll tell you, it's a good thing if you can convince worldly, sinful people to follow after Jesus, but you don't do that by any means necessary. You teach the truth. And the solution is to be ready, because we don't know when the final end will come. That leaves us with a question today. Are we ready? As I look out at this audience, I'm fairly certain everybody here is obeying the gospel, everybody in the accountable age. But maybe there's some other reason where you don't feel like you are ready today. We don't know when the Lord is coming back. It could be any moment. We don't know when our name is going to be called and we're going to pass on from this life. And so make sure that you're ready. And if you need to make something right, if you want the prayers of the church, then we can help you with that this morning while we stand and sing the song of the